Welcome to the Gay Buddhist Forum, where teachers from all schools of Buddhism offer their perspectives on the Dharma and its application in modern times, especially for LGBTQI audiences. These talks are offered freely to the world and made possible by appreciative listeners. If you would like to support our efforts to share the Dharma with underserved audiences, please visit gaybuddhist.org. There you can donate, find a list of upcoming speakers, or enjoy many hundreds of these recorded talks dating back to 1996.
I've been practicing primarily Vipassana Buddhism or Theravadan Buddhism, practicing Vipassana, mindfulness, as well as quite a bit of study in the Mahayana tradition and teachings from Zen and Tibetan teachers, but primarily practicing Vipassana in the insight, kind of the Western American interpretation of Theravadan Buddhism. My teacher is Jack Kornfield and Ajahn Amaro, who's a monastic, about 25 years now. Been my teacher for about a dozen years. So this, and as I said, I've been teaching in juvenile halls. I started practicing meditation actually when I was locked up as a teenager. And so about 10 years later, after I'd been practicing for about 10 years, I started going back into the same juvenile hall actually that I had started practicing in and teaching classes for the youth who were incarcerated there. It was a really powerful healing experience for me to kind of have that full circle in my life. And then a couple years ago, after being the director of the Teen and Family Program at Spirit Rock Meditation Center for a couple years, Jack Kornfield invited me into the teacher training, and so now I'm actually getting some formal training. But actually I started teaching when my father started to encourage me, and many of you know my father, probably Stephen Levine. And when he started to encourage me to share my experience and understanding of the Dharma, that's when I started to take this seat. And for me, this process is just more practice. Whether I'm sitting or talking about the Dharma, it's all a practice in mindfulness. This talk is my favorite that I'm going to share with you guys today. And I think probably I'm the only one that gives it so far. Well, actually, it's not quite true. Robert Thurman has similar perspective. But I call this talk Buddhist Practice as Anti-Establishment Rebellion. And it comes out of my own personal experience of coming to the Dharma, coming to Buddhist practice, out of years of struggle with addiction, incarceration, violence. My whole youth was spent in an outward rebellion. Well, probably by looking at me, you can tell that rebellion hasn't quite ended, but it's certainly been channeled in different directions. I was rebelling, against the so-called system, society, and in the most confused ways, looking for happiness, and the most deluded, angry, confused ways, searching for freedom, which, in my experience, landed me in jail again and again and again. And at 17 years old, having suffered enough, having several felonies, I was looking at spending the rest of my life in prison and was somewhat resigned to that being my fate. But something happened, and I was locked up, and I had tried to kill myself in the cell. and was in the rubber room for a while. And my first conversation with my father, who's a meditation teacher and practitioner for my whole life, about 40 years now, his practice. And sharing with him the hopelessness that I was feeling and the situation. And he offered me these simple instructions of the Buddha in mindfulness of breath, present time awareness, as the solution to my dilemma, to my suffering, as a tool to do my time and to find some freedom within that. And it worked. However much resistance and whatever I had the willingness, inspired by pain in that moment, to start practicing. And I went to my cell and I started watching my breath and had a powerful experience of like, at least if I'm paying attention to this breath, this body sensation in this moment, I'm not freaking out about the future in prison. I'm not beating myself up about the past and all the shame I feel in the present moment. Of course, I wasn't very adept at it. I could only maybe have a half a breath before my mind went back to beating me up. But started to train myself in that, seeing that there was a refuge in the breath, in the moment, in the present time. And then as I seriously came to meditation practice, realizing that nothing outside of myself was going to give me what I was looking for, wasn't the happiness that I was going to find, wasn't in any material or sense object. Really clearly seeing that it wasn't in drugs and alcohol, and it wasn't in crime and violence, and it wasn't even in sex. I sort of held out for that one for a while. Like, well, maybe that, a really pleasant sexual experience, If I could get that a lot, that might work. And even having the experience, that's not even ultimately satisfying. It's all transient. It's all impermanent. But being a punk rocker, as I came to practice, I was really confused whether meditation and spiritual practice was going to be compatible with my really strong anti-authority and anti-establishment sentiment. I wondered if, since I was doing spiritual practice, I had to just accept everything. I had to just accept all of the lies, the blatant ignorance of our society. If I had to think that everything was just okay the way it was, that I had to start seeing everything as just an illusion, that I need to turn my back on the punk scene that I had grown up in and had, kind of loved so much. I wondered if I had to kind of just float away on some sort of spiritual cloud, having all of those early practitioner ideas about what to be spiritual meant. So this talk really comes out of my 15 years of grappling with those questions as I've been practicing. And now, my further study into actually what the Buddha taught. And how I've come to integrate my anti-establishment ideals with a deep commitment to spiritual practice and faith in the Dharma and the teachings of the Buddha. When the Buddha was enlightened, upon enlightenment after he had been sitting under the Bodhi tree, after his 7 years of intensive practice and his resolve to just sit there until suffering was gone, till he could awaken, till he was finally fully liberated. After his enlightenment, he just kind of hung around there at the Bodhi tree. I'm sure all of you or many of you know this very well. That for several days he just kind of hung out in this like, wow, I'm enlightened. Now what? I think I'll just hang out and enjoy it. And in the scriptures it says that he was not going to go teach. That he had no intention to go forth and spread the Dharma after his enlightenment. He wasn't getting enlightened so that he could go teach. And actually, after his enlightenment, he hung out and just, decided that, from his all-seeing eye, that people wouldn't get it. That people were just too deluded, too confused. He spoke this verse. He said, "This Dhamma that I have attained is too profound and hard to see. It's hard to discover. It is the most peaceful and superior goal of all, not attainable by mere reflection. It is subtle for the wise to experience. But this generation," and he's talking about 2,500 years ago in India, where it looked like people were doing some pretty serious spiritual practice, and spirituality and religion was really part of their upbringing and culture. He said, but this generation relies upon attachment, relies and relishes in attachment, delights in attachment. It is hard for such a generation to see this truth. That is to say, interdependence, conditioned arising. It is hard to see this truth, that is to say, the stilling of all formations, relinquishing of the essentials of existence, the exhausting of craving, the fading of lust, cessation, nibbana. And if I taught the Dhamma, others would not understand me. And that would be wearying and troublesome for me. Thereupon came this stanza that's recorded in this sutta, where he said, "Enough of this teaching of the Dhamma, that even I found hard to reach, for it will never be perceived by those that live in lust and hate. Died in lust with whom a cloud of darkness laps, will never see. This teaching, this experience that goes against the stream, is subtle, deep, hard to see, and abstruse." The Buddha, said that it's against the stream, this path. And that he was hesitant to teach it, knowing that the masses would never get it, and not so sure that even the few, the wise, would get it. This Pali word, patiso tagami, against the current or against the stream, depending on how it is translated. When I heard that teaching, it fit perfectly with my anti-establishment, rebellious attitude and outlook upon life. Because my whole life I'd been trying to go against the norm, against the stream. So when I found out that the Buddha actually described this path in those terms, it fit perfectly with what I already knew to be true, that society, that the false promises of materialism would never satisfy my own craving for happiness, my own craving for freedom. Ajahn Amaro, my monastic teacher, often, when I talk about these teachings with him, says, "Yes, but you got to make sure that you're going against the correct stream. You can't just go against everything, Noah," he says to me. And that's really true. And the stream that the Buddha is describing is the stream of greed, of hatred, and of delusion. And that is where the work is to be done, against aversion and attachment, and not just blindly against everything. So from this perspective, I think that the act of awakening is an act of revolution against oneself, against one's tendencies, against this attachment that the Buddha described. I think this could be called an inner revolution, an act of rebellion against the internal oppressive forces of greed and hatred and delusion. Lucky for us, Even though the Buddha had that reflection after his enlightenment, God came to Buddha. Brahma, the creator, a heavenly being, came to the Buddha and implored him to teach. He said, there are those who will understand the Dharma if you teach it. Not everyone, but there are few who have only a little dust in their eyes, who seeing is only slightly obscured. And that if you go forth and teach, there are these beings that will hear the Dharma, understand the Dharma, and practice the Dharma till liberation, till freedom. The Buddha then reflected upon those teachings, or reflected upon that, and he looked at his own experience, and he saw, without going into the sutta, it said that he was at this Bodhi tree and there was this lotus pond. And he saw that the lotuses were growing up out of the mud, and that some were fully submerged underneath the muck. Some were just penetrating the surface, and other lotuses were actually in full blossom. And they were of different colors and different. And as he saw this, he reflected, yes, so many people are stuck in the mud. Some beings are just above, and there are actually beings who are in the sunlight, who can actually see and hear and practice the Dharma. And he was convinced of the usefulness and skillfulness of teaching the Dharma, and he decided that he would start by teaching his old colleagues, the sadhus that he'd been practicing with. And he went and he found them and taught them the Four Noble Truths, which set this wheel of Buddhist teachings in motion. He taught of suffering, the cause of suffering, the end of suffering, and the path to liberation. So for the sake of this talk, I see these teachings as the tools, for lack of a more skillful term, the weapons of the inner revolution, of the anti-establishment fight for freedom. Nirvana is often referred to as extinguishing through the cultivation and discovery of wisdom and compassion, that we extinguish greed, these fires, the three fires of greed and hatred and delusion, that we extinguish the sense of self, the belief in permanence, and the grasping or clinging that creates suffering. Once we have extinguished these, once we've become victorious in this internal, against the stream path, we've led upstream against the current and extinguished these fires. This is the kind of, for the sake of this talk, the victory in the inner revolution, in the inner rebellion, and the path to freedom. That this path includes present time awareness, mindfulness, generosity, loving kindness, equanimity, forgiveness, the concentration that's developed through paying attention that leads to wisdom. So as well as the personal path of Buddhist practice from this perspective being an act of revolution, I also like to look at the life and teachings of the Buddha as a map, as the possibility of actually an external revolution as well. that although it's very clear from the Buddhist teachings that there will never be world peace, that there will always be wars, that there will always be oppression and greed and hatred, that there always has been and there always will. This is why, the Buddha taught, was even hesitant to teach that that's just the way it is, that part of our practice is acceptance of that truth. And the other part of our practice is doing all that we can all of the time to bring freedom to ourselves and to others, to stop greed and hatred and oppression, ignorance. And so I like to look at the Buddha and see his example of being the first spiritual teacher in India, maybe in the world, I don't know, probably not in the world, but at that time anyways, to really break down the racist and sexist structure of the religious and spiritual path at that point. Up to that time, it was believed that women could not get enlightened, that Indians with darker skin, the lower castes, could not get enlightened, could not do practice, were not welcome into temples or into spiritual traditions, that only the Brahmins could really get enlightened. And the Buddha was, totally anti-establishment in that way. He was a revolutionary. Let women into the Sangha. Broke down the caste system. Many of the monks and nuns, people that came, to the Buddha's teachings, were also quite rebellious. I mean, he had murderers, Angulimala. Perhaps you know the story of the serial killer that became a Buddhist and became enlightened. He had many prostitutes that became nuns. He had the first few, or some of the early hundreds and hundreds of his converts were these fire worshippers with dreadlocks and that kind of hung out and smoked bongs and worshipped fire before they heard his teachings. And they all become, so it was all of these sort of hooligan, counterculture, folks were followers of the Buddha that practiced the Dharma. And so this is also inspiring to me of that there's something about those who are already going counterculture, coming to the Dharma, and having an easier time seeing it, having less dust. I think we see that in America too. I don't know how much now, but certainly as Buddhism has come to America, really kind of taking its footing with the beatniks, these counterculture types, and then the hippies, counterculture. And so, it's sort of my hope that my generation of punk rockers, counterculture, Generation X, will also be able to come to the Dharma in the way that I have, and have the kind of transformation that I've experienced. One of my favorite aspects of Buddhism is its empowering aspect. That the Buddha said, question everything. That after every talk, the Buddha said, don't take my word for it. Find out for yourself if this is true. Don't have faith in me. Practice the Dharma. See what leads to happiness and freedom. In this sutta to the Kalamas, he said, it is indeed fitting to be uncertain. It is fitting to doubt, for in situations of uncertainty, doubts surely arise. And you should decide not by what you have heard, not by following convention, not by assuming it is so, not by relying on the texts, not because of reasoning, not because of logic, not by thinking about explanations, not by acquiescing to the views that you prefer, not because it appears likely, and certainly not out of respect for a teacher. When you would know for yourself that things are unhealthy and lead to suffering, then reject them. And, goes on to say, but when you would know for yourselves that these things are healthy, that entered upon and undertaken inclined toward welfare and happiness, then coming to them yourself, you should stay with them. If it is the welfare, it is for the welfare of yourself. And so this question authority. Don't trust the teachers. Don't trust in your own deepest experience. So for me, this kind of fit with my fuck authority attitude, my question authority attitude, and empowered me to find out through my own present time awareness, investigation of the mind and body and heart, through my own direct experience in this path, and not to accept what anyone has to say, not even the Buddha, but to take it and apply it and see if it's true for myself. And there has been some historical examples of how Buddhism has brought about periods of peace to certain regions. In ancient India, in the time of King Ashoka, as Buddhism actually spread as the national religion, there was very little war. There was very little oppression at that time. As people take to these teachings of nonviolence and practice them on a greater scale, there were periods, years, hundreds of years, of a greater sense of peace. Also, in Tibet, as Buddhism traveled to Tibet, it's said by some scholars that before Buddhism came to Tibet, that they were these, they were almost like the Huns, the Tibetan people were, horsemen, and, they were going and they were raiding the Chinese and very violent and, raping and pillaging the Tibetan people before Buddhism came. And that they had conquered sort of the physical realm, and they had moved higher and higher into the heights of the Himalayas. And then as Buddhism came, they had conquered the external realm and they went inward to conquer the internal realm. And the teachings of Buddhism and the native Tibetan Bun tradition, and brought, periods of great peace, not total peace, but great peace, until the Chinese invasion, communist occupation, and genocide of the Tibetan people. And some Tibetan teachers actually say that they feel that it's their cultural karma. That because their ancestors had done so much violence and negative actions towards the Chinese and in that region, that the communist Chinese coming in was actually just their cultural karma for their ancestors' past actions. Robert Thurman speaks of this in the terms of the human evolution, saying that since the Tibetan people had conquered the physical world and then went on to conquer the inner world, that they had in some ways won this battle of the inner evolution. So I propose the possibility of spiritual revolutionaries not only bringing peace to ourselves, but also bringing about less suffering to the world, more happiness, and perhaps periods of peace in certain regions. This doesn't fit completely with the Buddha's teaching that samsara, that the realm we find ourselves in, is just a realm of suffering, and that personal liberation is fully available to those who practice the path. But that samsara will never be nirvana, that it'll never be a place of happiness for all beings. So I invite us all to reflect on how our own Buddhist meditation practice has set us apart from the establishment. Even just as simply as taking the time out of our day to practice mindfulness, cultivation of compassion and wisdom, as a practice of rebelling against the media-driven consumer machine that we're surrounded by. Taking the time to look inward, to let go of greed rather than be propelled by it. That these are periods when, for the very least, we are not feeding the fires. We are beginning to extinguish them. That every mind moment of present time awareness, every mind moment of compassion, of reacting to suffering with caring rather than aversion, is an act of rebellion. That spiritual practice isn't natural and easy. That it takes effort and energy. And that if we don't practice, if we're not going upstream, we're going downstream. And that each effort, each moment, each cultivation of seeing clearly is going upstream. I was recently interviewed in this, question asked me about what I struggle with now. And so I see this path, as going upstream. And I saw that for years I was going so quickly down in greed and hatred and delusion. And then, I found the Dharma and I was like thrashing about, just trying to stop going down, to the point where I stopped, through practicing a lot. But I wasn't really making any progress because I was in the center of the stream trying to swim as fast as I could. And then I get tired. And that actually I see our practice, and those of you who know, is that when you're going against the current, you actually have to swim side to side. If you try to swim straight against it, you don't go anywhere. You have to, if you're going up the lake or if you're in the current or in the ocean, you actually have to swim to the side. And that by going this way and then going this way, we make progress. And it's a steady progress. And it's a continual, daily, moment-to-moment practice. And that it's not about doing it for a little while and then giving it up. So these are some, actually I had to skip around a lot because of the constraint of my time. But these are some of my reflections on Buddhist practice. Some of the ways I have skewed it, obviously, to fit with my own life's experience and, talk about it in these terms of anti-establishment, of the inner revolution. So I offer all of this to you, of course, not as the truth, but as something to reflect upon. For us all to look at our own experience and to see what's true in your own experience. And I'd love to make some time now for you to talk about anything you would like, of course, but especially how do you see your own practice as anti-establishment, as an inner revolution? Please.
Well, there's a lot of things that you said that resonated for me. And I think just as a song of gay men, just by being gay, we don't have much of a choice but being on the fringe, looking at this culture, and the culture defines us in a way that we have to challenge it if we want to have any kind of self-respect. So I think that's what you said is a very important message, at least for me. I'm curious. You used the metaphor of swimming sideways rather than directly into the current. I wonder if you could kind of give some actual
examples
right. of what that would be.
Right. I think that what it is, and it's just this sort of image that came up for me, but I think that what it is just the steady practice of daily sitting, of mindfulness as much in our other activities, of trying to, react with kind, just practicing in a steady way, in a our practice is this balance of effort and relaxation. And it's like too much effort, and you're just stemming, directly against it. You don't go anywhere. You pull a muscle, you pull your meditation muscle, whatever. And so it's more an image of just the steady, balancing of relaxation and acceptance. But there's just that, and I don't have the specific, but there's just this thing is like, I know, like when you swim directly against it, you don't go anywhere. When you go sideways, you get there. And so maybe sideways is as, actually I don't have clear examples, but yeah, it's more just about that steady effort, I think. Yeah, please.
Thank you for what you said. When you talk about going against the current, what occurs to me is how quickly our culture can accommodate even the most radical tendencies.
Yeah.
When I came of age as a gay man, it meant you were, what Clint just said, that's not true anymore.
Right.
It has been accommodated.
In some ways, maybe.
In some profound ways. Yeah. When I go to Spirit Rock, it's hard to miss. It's not just middle class.
Right.
It's upper middle class. It's very hard to continue what looks like it's against the current.
Yeah.
When the culture has been pretty good about accommodating things, and I wonder if you thought about that.
Definitely. And I don't know if I have that. I don't know that, whether the culture accommodates it or not. Dharma practice, real Dharma practice is difficult. And I don't care what your socioeconomic, whatever that doesn't matter. I don't, to me. It's, are you really practicing? Whether you have lots of money, whether you have no money, whether you're gay or straight or black or white, the truth is very few people will really practice towards liberation. And yes, definitely Buddhism has been co-opted, as a relaxation technique, as a cool place to be seen, as a hip place to go see the Dalai Lama, and it's all the fad and it's Hollywood and all that stuff. My feeling is that out of the, movement of Buddhism in the country and the kind of upper middle class, without putting a judgment on who's really practicing or not, I think that very few people, even within, the popularization of the Dharma, are really serious about liberation. And even in Asia, this is true. They say that there's only something like 10% of ordained Buddhists meditate on a regular basis. That Buddhism, there's the teachings of the Buddha, and then there's Buddhism, and that Buddhism, often is about bowing and chanting and offering incense and stuff like that, and it's not about the deep cultivation of non-grasping, of wisdom and compassion that leads to liberation. So because that's true in, the thousands of years of tradition in Asia, it's going to be true here too, Please. Yeah.
I was just thinking about one example. I thought it was what Clint said, and that was when I became HIV positive. Part of my anguish was, plugging into community, feeling so helpless that I couldn't do anything. Because I wanted to change the world. I wanted to change the national policy, and I finally realized that I finally found one thing I could do, and that was I could be an HIV pre-test and post-test counselor at the Berkeley Free Clinic. And that was about as much as I could do, but it was something, and it kept me from freaking out that I was impotent in this culture. And for years now, I've been training to be a sexual addiction counselor, and I see the headline of the Chronicle last Sunday, it really has the new stats about how speed and, HIV are just so on the rise in our culture, in our gay culture. It's really hard, to say, okay, I'll work with a couple of people.
Right.
But that's really all I can do. I don't think anyone's really figured out exactly why it's happening. I mean, you're a generation younger than I am, and if you have any insight into what's causing it, but there's people working 24/7,
Right.
on this, and
Right.
they don't seem to have come up with the answer. So, the only thing I can do is, sort of a counseling that involves mindfulness and a 12-step approach combination.
Mm-hmm.
And hope that working with a few people might. It would be wonderful, I'm glad your book's coming out, because I think it'll be very helpful to see, because there's a book that David Richo wrote called, what's the name of it? He's in recovery. It's Shadow something like it, but he believes that the energy, addictive energy, is really very positive energy that has sort of taken a wrong turn. And I really
Totally.
like your talk, that if sort of coaching myself here, say that your energy is real. The energy is good. It's just got to.
Where do you put it?
Another direction in order to bring you the happiness and the freedom that because that's what addicts are looking for. They're looking for happiness and freedom. I think you're right on. It's a great kind of tool to use, in counseling. So blah blah blah. So I guess my question is: do you have any insight into what's causing the suffering in the next generation?
So I have several reflections on what you said. First of all, no. Cause, I could do that mental thing, but I don't truly have insight into the cause other than it's just the way it is. But I agree with you completely that our work, and I think, that our work is to be of service to those that we can. To do all we, without the unrealistic expectation of ending anything, doing all we can. And there's the story of the little girl, and she's walking on the beach, and all of the starfish have washed up, and there's hundreds of them, there's thousands of them, and they're dying in the sunlight. And she's walking down the beach, and she's picking one at a time and throwing it back in the ocean to save it. Some grouchy old guy comes up and says, "You can't save all these starfish. What you're doing doesn't matter." And she picks another one up and another one. She says, "Yeah, but it matters to this one. And it matters to this one. And it matters to this one." And that's how I see our work. As that it totally and completely matters to those that we connect with on a heart level. To those that we serve. And that we, there's this broader thing, and it's great to work for the broader, but to stay connected to the community, to those, for me, I think what you're doing is perfect, and I think we all need to look at our own life, and I think the gay community has been so great at this, of serving the community. I've looked at my life and said, I can serve in the prison because I've been there, so I go in the prison and I serve there. I actually was an HIV test counselor for 4 years before coming into doing this stuff. Just looking at our own life's experience and saying, where can I help the best? How can I help the best? Totally. And the other piece is that, being an addict in some way, having that compulsive is great if you get into Dharma practice, if you get into recovery and you get into Dharma practice, because I'm upset, I'm going to sit every day. I was a junkie. I'm not interested in the wine cooler of spiritual practice. I want the heroin. And so for me, I do lots of retreats, and I go off and, 3-month silent retreats, and, because I want liberation. I want real freedom. I'm not satisfied with a buzz here and there. Please.
Yeah. In terms of looking at spiritual practice as a revolution, when I look back at my biography of resistance, to the extent that I've identified with it, I find it, I think it has been a stumbling block.
Yeah.
To the extent that I've, found persona and ego definition in what I've said no to.
Mm-hmm.
It's been very sobering for me to look back and see how reflexive it was.
Yeah.
And how much righteous swelling I can do by judging entire cultures.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not totally comfortable with the paradigm of just because it seems to have some of that puffery to it. Do you know what I mean?
Totally.
I guess that's
I think you're right on.
Myself.
I think you're right on point, and that it's easy. And I've done, and I probably am doing it at this moment, and have done that a lot. That the ego attaches to anything. I think that ideally the goal, my intention, is not judging, but discerning what is true and what is not true. And not setting myself apart from others, but seeing that we're all doing the best we can, and that not everybody's going to get it. And so a piece of acceptance, that I'm doing my best to get it.
That's
revolutionary. Yeah. That's all part of it, yeah. But I think you're right on point in that, our egos attach to everything. To everything. And there's definitely a danger of attaching to any persona, and any, to whether to being Buddhist or to being anything. Ultimately, we can't attach to being anything. We have to, really deeply see that this is just a process. This is temporary phenomena arising and passing. With a memory, with the conditions, the fetters of memory and consciousness that then attach to things, and we take it as self. But none of it is self. And so I can say that, but I don't live from that place. Most of the time I walk around, kind of puffed up about who I am. And then I hit the cushion and see it all dissolving and realize, it's not me. But yeah, it's a good warning, please.
Yeah, I was wanting to say something similar, but also not discourage in any sense the effort. I think it's so important. Such an important step to see this guy in gold up here as the revolutionary, as the rebel, kind of like Jesus in his day. Right? Yeah. He didn't die for our sins. He died because he was a revolutionary.
Right.
And, but yeah, I refer to it as the 7 deadly virtues.
Right. That ultimately it all has to be let go of. Yeah, for sure. Please.
Yeah, one more question. I'm really curious how you go into the juvenile detention centers of the inmate populations and make this a message that can resonate with them and be attractive to them. So in some ways, it seems like Buddhism is a very intellectual discipline,
right?
An abstract discipline. How do you put balls to it?
I don't teach Buddhism in the institutions. I teach mindfulness. And I go in and I say, I've been where you're sitting, and I was in a lot of pain, and I was really scared, and I was taught this simple technique of present time awareness, and it helped me. And if you're scared and you're, wanting some help, this is something that might help you. If you want to check it out, it's an open-handed offering, and I don't talk about it as spiritual or religious. To the kids. Of course, they're so bright, and we're in the Bay Area. They know I'm teaching Buddhism, most of them. And they say, and they call me on it sometimes. But I don't present it as, I present it as John Kabat-Zinn, mindfulness-based stress reduction, much more in that population. In the prison in San Quentin, there's lots of guys that I'm working with. I'm teaching meditation. I'm doing substance abuse counseling there and doing psychotherapy. And there's lots of guys who are actually really interested in becoming Buddhist. And so then I work with them kind of from a Buddhist perspective. The rest of the guys, and then there's all these other guys who are Muslim or Christian or whatever who want to meditate, and use the tools. So really just offering it as this tool that works, of paying attention to the present moment and letting go of the future and letting go of the past and being here now with the intention to let go of whatever is arising, that stuff. People, and there's 6,000 people in San Quentin. I get 20 people a week. There's 1 million people in San Francisco. We have 40 people here this morning. It's always just going to be a few. It's not for everyone. It doesn't make us better or worse. That's discernment. It's just not for everyone. So last one, I'd actually like to read you guys just a piece from my book, and also invite you all to my book release party that's happening in a couple weeks. Please.
Oh, I was just going to say I was stimulated by that thought. I have worked with prisoners, and it's my observation that discipline is a bad thing, and it's imposed and therefore considered destructive. But if you can turn that around, which is another example of revolutionary thinking.
Yeah.
The discipline comes from inside, and you can have it, and it's valuable. They're automatically interested. And this is an unheard of thought.
Right. That it's empowering.
But it's instinctively, they know they can get power from it.
Yep.
Power over their own lives.
Yeah.
And, so any discipline at all that coheres, Muslims do very well for that reason. They can turn your life around if you follow the discipline.
Mm-hmm. So thank you. I guess we're actually out of time. Read it? What should I read? I'll just read a little piece here of the preface. The Dharma Punx is my story, and it's a story about my generation. The punks. Kids all around the world who searched for meaning and liberation in the age of Reagan, Thatcher, and the Cold War's constant threat of total nuclear annihilation. I sought a different path than my parents. I totally rejected meditation and all the spiritual shit their lives were built on. Busted, I guess. Looking at the once idealistic hippie generation who had long since cut their hair, left the commune, and bought into the system, we saw that peace and love had failed to make any real changes in the world, and in response we felt despair and hopelessness, out of which came the punk rock movement. Seeking to rebel against our parents' passivism and society's fascist system of oppression and capitalist-driven propaganda, we responded in our own way, different from those before us, creating a new revolution for a new generation. Painfully aware of the corruption in the government and the inconsistencies in the power dynamics in our homes, we rebelled against our families and society in one loud and fast roar of teen angst. Unwilling to accept the dictates of the system, we did whatever we could to rebel. We wanted freedom and were willing to fight for it. The situation was compounded by the personal despair that I and so many of my generation were facing. Broken homes, addicted parents, useless school teachers, and a total lack of elders to look up to. Most of our parents were too busy to pay attention to us as they tried to survive the aftermath of the 60s or succeed in the race for riches of the 70s and 80s. In my case, my mother was battling with addiction and 2 broken marriages, doing her best to raise 4 children. And my father was so dedicated to spiritual practice and service that at times it kept him from being as available to me as I probably needed. So I and countless others hit the streets, fueled by the music of revolution, anger, angst, fear, despair, hatred, and a total dissatisfaction with the status quo. We dyed our hair and shaved our heads. We donned a new uniform to set us apart from the mindless masses of adults, brain-dead herds of kids who are going along with the lies, buying into the great American fallacy, playing sports, going to high school, and listening to the awful popular music of the 80s that carried no meaningful messages and was just another symptom of the disease of apathy and materialism that plagues our society.
I won't buy this book.
So, 2 more pieces. Drugs and booze seem to be the only effective escape from the feeling of hopelessness and despair. Many of us went directly to narcotics as teenagers, eating acid like it was candy and chasing speed with cheap vodka, smoking truckloads of weed, consuming gallons of cheap beer, all in a vain attempt to get numb and stay numb. We embraced a nihilistic outlook on life. Set apart from the mainstream society, we were a constant target of violence and ridicule, fighting to survive, fighting for our views, for the right to be different. We often found ourselves involved in some battle or another. If it wasn't with the cops, it was with the jocks or hicks or each other. Lives of drugs and violence led to many early deaths, overdoses, murders, car accidents, and countless suicides. Death and grief have been a central part of the lives of all the kids who are associated with the early punk rock scene. Following the example set by Sid Vicious and Darby Crash, our goal was to live fast, do lots of drugs, and fuck the system by dying young. Half of the kids from the crew of punks I hung out with in the 80s are dead. This book is about those of us who didn't die young and are still around. Those of us who don't go around talking about punk as just a phase we went through as kids. Dharma Punx is about those of us who, motivated by the same dissatisfaction with life that brought us to the punk rock scene, have now turned towards spiritual practice as a non-violent form of the revolution. It's a story about finding in meditation and service the freedom I was seeking as a young idealistic punk rocker. Having clearly seen the uselessness of drugs and violence, I and others have found positive ways to channel our rebellion against the lies of society. Still fueled by anger at injustice and suffering, now we use that energy to awaken to our own natural wisdom and compassion instead of for self-destruction. It goes on, but our time is up. So, May 27th, if you want a copy or interested, my book party, I put some of these cards out on near the T there. We're having a party at 3:30 Rich on May 27th. It's a Tuesday night. A bunch of my friends' punk rock bands are going to play, and I'm going to do a book reading and some free food. You're all welcome to come party with us. And it was really a pleasure to get to spend the morning with you guys. Thank you for having me. Yeah.
Thank you for listening to the Gay Buddhist Forum. If you would like to hear several new talks per month and be notified of upcoming speakers so you can participate live, please subscribe to this podcast, like us on Facebook, and join our mailing list by visiting gaybuddhist.org.